this morning, so for about the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about some work that we're doing. Part of it's Chekhov funded work through the National Pork Board, and also some other side projects that we're doing with up at Iowa State with regard to evaluating antibiotic alternatives. And I'm going to parenthesize here, we're really interested in looking at growth-promoting antibiotic alternatives. We're not looking to actually replace antibiotics when it comes to some nutritional strategies. It's actually the growth-promoting antibiotic alternatives in nursery pigs. So for the last 50 years or so, antibiotics have been used as antimicrobial agents, but also for growth-promoting purposes in livestock and avian species. And they could include chlorotetracyclines, penicillins, virginiamycins, etc., have all been commonly used as feed additives or in water. However, as of January this year, the FDA has now really approved the use of antibiotics for really three main purposes. And that's going to be disease treatment, disease control, and disease prevention. In other words, these are going to be the labelled therapeutic use for treating clinically sick animals or preventing, reducing the incidences of infectious disease agents in swine production and also in other livestock production. And this is important because if you look at this figure here, there's about 55% of cases that come through the veterinary diagnostic lab for swine are associated with some sort of bacterial component. And so the therapeutic use of antibiotics is still going to be important to actually help mitigate some bacterial problems that we see, whether it's in combination with PRRS or if it's actually PD plus bacterial challenges. These secondary infections is going to be important to still be able to use therapeutic antibiotics. So as I said, as of this year, the FDA have really classified medically important antibiotics that's going to be the ones that are used in the same class to treat humans as being exempt for use in animals for growth promoting purposes and also for general use. There are some exceptions to that, niacin, tomulin, etc. But really, over the last 50 years, there's been a lot of work has actually used growth-promoting antibiotics to improve nutrient efficiency of pigs. And this could lead to improved feed efficiencies, improved growth rates, but it may not necessarily mean improvements in, or say, decreasing mortality. We still could have the mortality associated with this. But antibiotic growth promoters have been used really for growth rates and feed efficiency gains within livestock, especially in the nursery stage of pig production. And these have been administered at a low or subtherapeutic dose. So really not a therapeutic dose to really control a lot of pathogenic microorganisms. And so really what the key words that the government wants us to use is judicious use of antibiotics for the treatment with veterinary oversight for the treatment of pathogenic problems. And then we got to not use them for really growth promoting purposes or sub-therapeutic purposes. And so, as I said, there's ionophores that still being able to use, carbidox, bactericins also can be used. But one of the potential issues with finding alternatives to growth-promoting antibiotics is really this statement down the bottom here. We really don't know the exact mode of action of how subtherapeutic antibiotics have actually work. They could have a direct effect, an indirect effect, so they could have a direct effect on the host, and they could have an indirect effect through the microbiota. So in other words, if we're using subtherapeutic antibiotics for growth-promoting purposes, we could be altering the microbial populations that are found in the lumen or in the enteric environment, but we also could have some direct effects on the actual pig itself. And this leads to an optimal health outcome that can then lead to the improved feed efficiency or growth rates. But the exact mode of action, even though we've used these antibiotics for 50 years for growth-promoting purposes at sub-therapeutic levels, the exact mode of action is still somewhat not known. But it is a combination of direct impact on the host as well as direct impact or indirect impact on the microbiota, which then can impact the host, i.e. the pig, and therefore lead to enhanced performance benefits. And so what I want to do for the next minute or so is actually just highlight some of the potential modes of action of which growth-promoting antibiotics may function. First of all, if you look at this left side here, I'll just orientate you. This is the luminal environment or the enteric environment. This could be the small or large intestine up here. This will be the actual small intestine because we've got villi. This is our epithelial layer. We've got our bloodstream down here in the lymphatic vessels. This is all the microbiota. So growth-promoting antibiotics may function by altering the microbial composition that's found in the lumen, and also that what may be attached to the intestinal epithelium, or in this perfusion layer here. Therefore, reducing the pathogenic bacterial burden that the pigs may see. And this is known more as a bacterial-centric hypothesis. But the other way, there could be some direct implications actually on the intestinal epithelium itself, or even on the host itself, where we actually see a shift in actually metabolic resources. It could mean either increased first-pass metabolism of nutrients. In other words, by using antibiotic growth promotants, we're actually improving nutrient uptake and utilization by the host, and less nutrients are actually going to be metabolized directly within the epithelium, more available for post-absorptive purposes, such as lean tissue growth. Or it could be dampening or attenuating the inflammatory or the immune response, immunomodulatory response, where therefore there's less immune cell infiltration occurring into the lamina propria and intestinal epithelial region of the animal, and therefore allowing more resources to be used for post-absorptive purposes. But as I said before, depending on the antibiotic that's been used, we really don't know what the mode of action is. So by understanding the mode of action, we can actually have a better idea of what nutritional alternatives we can actually use as feed grade and alternatives to antibiotic growth promoters. So knowing that the laws were going to change as of the start of this year, last summer in collaboration with the NADC up at Ames, and also with Chris Tuggle here in the audience, we designed a project where we were interested in actually comparing antibiotic or feed-grade antibiotic compared to some nutritional alternatives. And so we had a positive-negative control. So I'm just going to set up this nursery project for you. And so we did a 5-week nursery study. These were 21-day-old weaned pigs. We had a control pig, or controlled diet pig. This is ends of 12 here. We have a controlled diet pig. We had chlorotetracycline in the nursery diet at subtherapeutic levels. We had 5% inulin in the diet in substitution for corn. We had 5% resistant starch. So we're interested in some of the dynamics of non-starch polysaccharides and how they were going to get fermented and actually have a prebiotic effect. And then we also had a butyrate, a calcium butyrate. So we had these in the diet for a 5-week nursery term. And as we can see here, if we just focus on the black line, this is our antibiotic naive pig. It gained over the actual 5 weeks, it gained about, this is delta body weight, it gained about 11 kilograms. When we had chlorotetracycline at about 80 parts per million in the diet, we gained about 15 kilograms. So there's about a 4 kilogram gain in body weight just over that 5-week period that we saw with antibiotic growth promoter present. So then we were interested in how would, whether it's butyrate, resistant starch or inulin, can it actually improve growth performance and feed efficiency in these pigs? Well, when we look at feed efficiency, we don't see any differences when we use some of these prebiotics or even butyrate in these pigs. However, our resistant starch pigs, we gained about, compared to our control pigs, we gained about 80 grams a day extra growth rate by having a resistant starch diet. Where our CTC pigs' average daily gain over this period were about 100 grams a day different. So in other words, using a growth-promoting antibiotic, we're gaining about 100 grams a day, and there is an opportunity to use nutritional interventions to actually try and gain some of that growth rates over a 5-week nursery period. And so, as I said, this is preliminary data, and what we're looking at here is actually some of the Cecal short-chain fatty acids. And so we thought that with feeding the inulin and resistant starch, we would actually increase short-chain fatty acid production. But if you look at our total short-chain fatty acid production here, we don't really see, I'll orientate you, this is the control pigs, this is the chlorotetracycline, inulin, resistant starch, and butyrate. Overall, we didn't see there's a lot of variability with regard to Cecal short-chain fatty acids with regard to these diets. Butyrate was higher if we look at Cecal butyrate in our butyrate-fed pigs. So that means at least our diet was working. So we had elevated butyrate levels in this top center panel. But overall, outside of resistant starch, we don't see any remarkable differences. And we haven't run stats on this yet because we're still waiting for another replicate of samples to come. We see that resistant starch is increasing, at least numerically increasing, valine and propionate concentrations in the cecum. And so we really don't know what the contribution is of short-chain fatty acids to this improved growth rates, but at least from the resistant starch standpoint, these short-chain fatty acids may be beneficial and actually that allow for that significant improvement in growth rates over the control. But however, when we looked at the CTC treatment, here in the yellow boxes, there's nothing there that really suggests that short-chain fatty acid production in the cecum is contributing directly to the growth performance benefits that we see. So therefore, it could be more post-absorptive differences as a result of this AGP use, or it could be alterations in intestinal function integrity, which we've not picked up here. But I will say, when we looked at some ex vivo measures of intestinal integrity and function, or as you guys in the industry would like to refer to it as leaky gut, we did not see any improvements or differences between our chlorotetracycline ileal samples with regard to intestinal integrity or permeability compared to our antibiotic negative naive pigs. We see no differences in macromolecule permeability. We see no differences in transepithelial resistance across that membrane, which are two markers of intestinal integrity. And we also see no gene abundance differences with regard to tight junction proteins as a result of chlorotetracycline. So this would indicate that a lot of the mode of action of chlorotetracycline is either directly on the microbiota itself, i.e. mitigating pathogenic microbiota, or it's post-absorptive. But there's a lot more work that we're trying to figure out here, because if we can actually understand the mode of action of some alternatives to growth-promoting antibiotics, therefore we can actually use a combination of pre and probiotics or organic acids or yeast cell extracts, etc., to actually help kind of get that average daily gain back up in our nursery pigs. So the main part of my talk I want to focus on is going to be on our pork board project that they funded us through Cecal dollars last year. And so with this pork board Cecal project, the pork board gave us two big tasks. One, and we may not be able to achieve all the goals that they've set, but what they gave us was they wanted us to evaluate the literature, so in other words, the last 25 years of literature, and work out what growth-promoting antibiotic alternatives are out there and how do they function. Which ones at what concentrations are improving growth performance, mortality, or decreasing mortality, feed efficiency, etc. Then also they would like us to actually present to them a standardized testing procedure to evaluate these alternative products. And so I'll present some of the data that we've got so far. This is an ongoing project. It's going to be another 9 to 12 months before we get that done, but there's two phases. So we've pretty much completed the first phase, which is really the literature review or the development part. We're presenting our validation study design to the pork board next week, or the week after I should say, and then we'll actually conduct that study shortly. So this here, this project is actually through a team of people. We've got Heather Allen and Crystal Loving at the NADC. We've got some of our vets at the vet school, as well as John Patience and myself from Animal Science Department. And then most of the literature review work, or all the literature review work, has been done by my PhD student, Wes Schwier, and then Kristen Olsen will be conducting the validation study. She's a master's student with Dr. Patience. So really, our two goals of this study was to develop a protocol to define the critical and essential components that can be measured and assessed when looking at antibiotic alternatives. So in other words, the industry, the pork will want to know what should they measure and how should they measure it when they're assessing these alternative compounds. And then to come up with some sort of standardized validation protocol of which then we can validate some AGP replacements in nursery pigs. And so right now we've conducted an extensive review of the literature, which I'll go through. We're in the process of setting up a validation study, and then we will then also provide to the pork board some data on a couple of different approaches. And what we're going to do with regard to the validation study, we're going to look at a combination of alternative products rather than just one single one. But really, just to get to the nuts and bolts of what Westshire has done for us. So what we've done for the literature review, since 1990, so the last 25, 26 years, we've reviewed, we've searched the databases for peer-reviewed journal articles. We've excluded articles that do not contain performance data or mortality data. In other words, our key criteria for inclusion of an article into this review process was it has to have a phenotypic measurement on the pig, i.e. growth performance, feed intake, feed efficiency, or mortality. If it didn't have any of those data mentioned in the abstract, it was excluded from the study. And then we looked for all articles that were peer-reviewed in English and full text. And so we searched these databases here. These are the major kind of scientific databases that we can get our hands on: PubMed, Science Direct, Web of Science, Cab Abstract, Agricola. We searched all years initially, and then we pared it down to 1990. So here's our search parameters that we've used for this project. And then we just had to put stuff into different categories, and we could recategorize this multiple ways. So we could put resistant starch fiber into and oligosaccharides. We could put them into prebiotics, but we decided to just separate them out. So we searched these, I think about 11 categories here: probiotics, prebiotics, oligosaccharides, organic acids, essential oils, botanicals, plant extracts, phytochemicals, yeasts, resistant starch, fiber, zinc, copper, and lysozyme. And then we use swine or pig in combination with these search terms in our database. Then we imported all our references that we found, excluding papers previous to 1990, into a reference database. We excluded duplicates if there was any coming from two different databases. Then Wes Schwer read all the abstracts and only kept articles that reported a measure of growth performance or mortality. We didn't care whether it was significant or not. As long as they mentioned average daily gain and or feed efficiency and or feed intake and or mortality, we kept those articles. So in other words, when we're evaluating these articles, we want to make sure that the pig is the key focus here and not a mode of action or a mechanism. Because there's a lot of articles out there that have looked at antibiotic alternatives, that have just looked at butyrate production in the lumen or in the feces, or looked at some gene abundance. That's been separated from the pig. We want to make sure that we had the pig phenotype present. And then we obtained all the articles that were in English. Then, once we've got all those articles, we then read every article, and they were evaluated for these key areas. Was a health challenge involved? Yes or no? How many N per treatment? What was the experimental unit? How many pigs per pen? Age of the pig, or day, that was in days or age. Start body weight. The genetics of the pig. Duration of the feeding. Was it 7 days, 21 days, 42 days, etc.? The general diet component, was it a corn soy-based diet, a wheat-based diet, barley-based, etc.? Average daily gain, feed intake, feed efficiency, reduced response, no response, or a positive response. Mortality, a plus in this case just means there was decreased mortality. A minus would mean there's increased mortality. 0, no change. Or if it wasn't reported, we just had NR, not reported. And then were blood assays conducted? So were metabolites measured, cytokines measured? And we just put a yes or no for now, so therefore we can go back in and isolate those papers. And then was tissues collected and assayed, yes or no? And microbiome, was it reported, yes or no? And once we evaluated all this, the other thing that we did, if the papers included a control and multiple treatments, we considered each treatment versus the control as one experiment for this study. So we looked at, say, for instance, if we had a control, a butyric acid, propionic acid, and butyric plus propionic, we'll consider this as 3 experiments in our review process. So to go through some of the different categories, with probiotics, we looked at, or we found about, that met our criteria, and that's up for debate, but this is the criteria that we've set. We had about 2,300 articles that we found, minus duplicates and taking out articles prior to 1990, we end up with about 1,600 articles. Of the 1,600, only 300 of them, or 288, contained mortality or performance actually in their abstract. So you can already see we've actually whittled down our available articles a fair way. And then the articles that were peer-reviewed in full English was 172. And just for instance, out of the 172, here's the probiotic types. There was 39 articles that had some sort of bacillus bacteria. 8 had E. coli. About 65 had a combo. Lactobacillus was 62. And then we actually have the species of each of these probiotics. The other thing is, since 1990, the genetic engineering of these probiotic strains have actually changed a fair bit, so we don't know the full details of how they actually compare to across the years, but we just had to use general class. So we had, for the time we broke down all the studies, we had 309 total studies in the probiotic category, 46 were challenged. And then the main thing we're going to focus on is just average daily gain for now. We had 172 studies out of the 309 that had a positive benefit on average daily gain. 40 had a positive benefit on feed intake and 78 on feed efficiency. And then 15 had a positive benefit on mortality. And when I say positive benefit, it's statistics of 0.05, or p-value of 0.05. The other interesting fact we're trying to get out for our validation study is actually we had an average pen size, or average end per treatment was 21, 6 pigs per pen, and then it was about a 36-day duration. And then it was a 14-kilogram pig, or 24 days of age. So here's some other numbers. Really there's, of the no change, we've broken it all out. Negative impact, no change, not reported, positive impact. And here we're trying to see if there's any relationship with start, body weight, or duration. And I'll summarise this at the end. Some general conclusions from the probiotic observations so far, and I said we're still analysing all these papers, but we don't see any genetic pattern or any relationship between the positive responses that we see. We had 44 different combinations of genetics were reported. Of the 122 positive average daily gains, 37 were probiotic combinations, 29 were lactobacillus, and then 8 of these 29 were lactobacillus plantarum. Then we had 16 enterococcus species, of which 15 of these 16 were enterococcus faecium. So in other words, we're starting to kind of get an idea of which probiotics are having a positive impact on average daily gain. When we look at prebiotics, we did the same thing. We had 500 articles. We got that down to really 53. So only 10% actually contained any performance or mortalities that met our criteria. And then again, I'll just go to the summary table here. Sorry, the overall observations that we see. We had 3 out of 10 used the sorbitol in the diet, and 3 out of 10 used the lactulose. A lot of them are corn soy based, and then we see no genetic pattern so far. Oligosaccharides, we had nearly 500 papers, down to 400 or 376, 44 available. Again, most of the studies that we've looked at or found are actually average age of about 22 days and about 7 to 12 kilograms body weight, so most of it is actually nursery orientated, with about 5 to 6 pigs per pen and 10 reps per treatment. With the oligosaccharides, we see no genetic pattern. We see 8 genetic combinations, and we see 7 out of the 17 were on a corn soy-based diet. And then if people want to know the exact oligosaccharides that we've used, I'm happy to share our database with you and actually go through in further detail. Organic acids was a big category that we found a lot of papers over the last 25 years. We had 130 papers, actually contained the performance or mortality measures, and then we had about 80 articles that were in full-length peer-reviewed. The problem that we faced with doing this type of evaluation is anything that was presented at say, a conference that wasn't peer-reviewed, we had to exclude. So there's a lot of good information, a lot of company information that's out there that's proprietary. We couldn't get all the information. It wasn't peer-reviewed. We had to exclude that from these searches. So average daily gain, we had 44 studies showed an improvement. And then if we look at the no genetic combination, a lot of genetic combinations were used, and most of these, half these studies were on a corn soy-based diet. But then we saw nothing really stand out from the phenotype data that we looked at to say why these studies have worked yet. So same with essential oils, we had 181 studies, and then really most of them were half corn soy based and no genetic combination. Yeast, 96 studies were looked at, and so of these we had 22 that had a positive benefit and average daily gain, 12 on feed intake, 10 of these studies were on feed efficiency. Again, most of the studies that we evaluated are in that 21-day weaned pig. And so we had 16 different genetic combinations. We had 15 out of 22 corn soy-based diet combinations were used. And again, the inclusion rates, there's nothing, we couldn't find any information that really substantiated why we saw a positive benefit with X inclusion rate. It was highly variable about the rates of inclusion of yeast products and then exactly what the yeast products were. So resistant starch, we saw 160 papers, and I'm just going to go through again. We saw no dietary pattern, so whatever the base diet was didn't really stand out to say that was a driving factor why resistant starch had a positive benefit. But probably the biggest one that most people utilise and look at is actually zinc and copper. And zinc and copper, we had 170 studies that had a positive benefit, but really a positive benefit on growth response was 211 studies. But this is the information here that we're trying to get at out of all studies. Of the 211 studies that had a positive benefit on average daily gain, 142 zinc studies used, of this 142 positives, 24 out of the 142 were using 3,000 parts per million in the nursery diet. Then 16 were using 2,500 parts per million. And then everyone else was using anywhere below 2,000, so anywhere from 200 parts per million up to 2,500. And with copper, we seem to be getting positive benefits between 250 to 200 parts per million with regard to benefits on growth performance. And this may be an issue if zinc and copper are going to get regulated like it may be in Europe by actually utilising this. But the biggest issue that we've had with all these studies is that there is virtually no one's been reporting what the health status is of the pigs that were utilised, what was the vaccination program, also was there feed-grade antibiotics actually used in the diet is often left out. We're assuming that probably over half the studies that we evaluated may have already had some sort of feed-grade antibiotic. There is virtually no one that's been reporting treatment records or even mortality rates. And so there's a lot of flaws in this research that's actually been presented that is very hard for us to make any general conclusions out of this. There's our last category that we've looked at. We saw lysozyme. There's 1,600 articles, but really only 16 contained growth performance and mortality. And I bet most of this 16 has probably come out of USDA MARC through Dr. Oliver's group. And so we found 9 articles. And then lysozyme in the nursery had about 4 out of the 9 actually had improvements in average daily gain. And so lysozyme is really just an enzyme that functions by attacking gram-positive cell wall bacteria. That's its mode of action. And it actually has some benefits. But then of the lysozymes also found in milk, 3 out of the 9 were in milk or milk replacer-based diets, and then 4 out of the 9 were in a corn soy-based diet. So here's the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do with regard to our validation study. If we look at all this work, body of work together, and we have to come up with a study, we're looking to get a benefit on an antibiotic growth promoting alternative. If we look at our days of age of pigs, to get a benefit, we're looking at starting average days of age is around 23, so we're looking at a weaned pig. We're looking at about a 10 kilogram body weight starting weight, and then it's about a 36-day study, so about a 5-week study is what seems to be having the most positive benefit. So this is some of the foundation that we're going to use for our validation study. The other thing is, do we do this in 1 pig per pen, or do we evaluate this on 25, 27 pigs per pen? And the short answer is we go from 1 pig per pen up to 600 or even 1,000 pigs as the experimental unit. And so in our validation study, what we're going to do, we're going to use our medium here around 6 to 10 pigs per pen, and then also have another group of pigs that will run at industry standard stocking densities around 25 to 27 pigs per pen, and see whether the pig numbers will actually have an impact on the products that we evaluate. So this is probably the most important slide that we've got so far. This is the percentage of significant differences in average daily gain response. So of the 267 probiotics, we have grey here is no response, red is a negative response, yellow is a positive response, and blue is not reported. So if we go across the board, really in the yellow, we can see 43 to 44% of the time we're getting a positive response if people are using high levels of zinc or copper. So remember, that's going to be 2,500 for zinc or 250 for copper. Lysozyme, it seems to be working 44% of the time in the studies that we evaluated. If we go to actually starch or fibres, there's about 9% of the time there's a positive benefit with average daily gain. But then we have to break down what are the starch components and what are the fibre components here. Yeast, we see yeast working about 25% of the time in regards to getting a significant improvement in average daily gain. And the botanicals in the similar ballpark. Organic acids about 34% of the time. Oligosaccharides, so mainly mosses and so forth, we're looking at 14%. Prebiotics, 11%, and then probiotics about 40%. And so really what this is saying is that we really need to have a combination of pre and probiotics and organic acids, etc. A combination of these different products in the nursery diet to actually get a benefit. Just a one-off product may not necessarily be the most advantageous. But then it's going to be up to debate of actually what that is. And I'm not going to give any recommendations of what combinations should be used, but generally speaking, it would make most sense if you had a probiotic in combination with a prebiotic. So in other words, you're feeding a microorganism with the substrate to actually improve the potential for it to colonize. But of course, you wouldn't do this with high levels of copper or zinc, because then that's going to play against that probiotic. And then you may have some yeast and some botanicals or organic acids in that combination. And so what we're going to do, we are going to combine probably 2 or 3 items or feed ingredients out of these categories, and we're going to evaluate them and then look at different biomarkers that relate to performance and health. What we want to do, there's a lot of information that is presented to the producers with regard to product X improves gut health or decreases inflammation and so forth. So we're going to give the pork board and the producers some information to say that these are the type of parameters that should be measured that make sense, that correlate with the growth performance, mortality, feed intake of the pigs. So what's up? What are we doing right now? We've got all this literature review in pivot tables so we can identify stuff, we can further break it down. We are happy to, because it's pork board checkoff funded work, we are happy to share those pivot tables with everyone who would like them. It's all in Excel form so we can actually sort everything. Then we're trying to identify what the good practices and must practices are when it regards to assessing growth promoting antibiotic alternatives. Should we measure CBCs or complete blood cell counts? Is it a requirement to measure microbiota? Should we look at pro-inflammatory cytokines? Should we look at short-chain fatty acids? If we do so, where should we look at them? Should we look at it in feces? Should we look at it in the cecum? Etc. So these are the type of information we're trying to do to then give the producer the best chance to actually find ways to improve growth performance and feed efficiency in their nursery pigs. And then we'll provide a validation study. So in conclusion, I can happy to talk to you about modes of action on any individual compound or product here. I can do that after the talk, but really there's going to be greater pressure for more judicious use of antibiotics in our production system, particularly in the nursery. When we're looking at antibiotic growth promotants, alternatives, unfortunately we're starting off behind the ball. Over the last 50 years, we should have more information about how they actually work, but we actually don't. And so it's a very complex area. It's not one silver bullet. There could be targeting the enteric microbiota, could be an area. It could be enteric metabolism or post-absorptive metabolism differences that are driving the growth response. Then there's the whole interaction with genetic selection for robustness, etc. also could play into this. So in other words, we're looking at direct and indirect functions. And then testing protocols need to be developed to best help the producer and you guys actually evaluate what's going to be the best alternatives to use to maintain or maximize growth performance when we can't use antibiotics.